800 Americans of African descent arrived in Egypt for a 2-week tour of the Nile Valley. This was the largest such group thus far to ever visit Africa, and it made the headlines in Egypt. Yet, it was more than a tourist event. While seeing the remnants of the ancient Nile civilization, the group would hear lectures giving a rare perspective about a culture that most history had misrepresented. The lectures would come from an accompanying group of African-American historians who were also there for their organization's conference that the tour group sat in on. This reporter was part of this 2-week experience, and this is the first of our 3-part special report that we call Return to the Nile Valley. Who everyone called Dr. Ben, and Professor John Henrik Clark. Most in the tour group had come as a result of a lecture they had heard or a book they had read by either of these two men. Many of the historians who were here had also had their attention on Africa focused by Drs. Ben and Clark.
In '68, when I got here, I became aware of Dr. Clark and Dr. Ben. I'd heard of both of them before, but I met them in early '69, I believe, and they had a tremendous impact on me, but I didn't get a chance to interact with them on a regular basis, and it was not until '75 when I met Diop that I was able to go day after day after day and get reprimanded and lectured to and so forth and so on. But no, Ben and John were right there from the beginning.
Dr. Ben, along with Dr. Clark and others, have been to the mountaintop. They looked over to the other side. And then they've been yelling and screaming to those of us down in the valley to come up to the mountaintop and see for yourself. Many of us have been able to work our way up and stand at their sides and see for ourselves. But too many of us are in the valley, lost, and we cannot see what is on the other side. Alone, they have changed the whole of history. They've destroyed the big lie. They've created a new concept of African self, a new concept of African consciousness.
History books have not always clearly depicted the Egyptian civilization as being explicitly African. In addition, the U.S. movie industry has depicted the people of ancient Egypt explicitly as white.
You will have to speak for yourself, physician.
Not for myself, sire, but for one whose memory you've tried to wipe out, whose very name you've sought to destroy, for Akhenaten.
Do you flaunt your treason in my face? That name is forbidden.
For decades, Professor Ben has been offering loudly another perspective of ancient Egyptian history. In fact, during the last 10-year period, Dr. Ben appeared on Like It Is several times, presenting his perspective on ancient Egypt.
My priority is the Africans along the Nile. And the reason for that is, if we deal with the Africans along the Nile, we will be dealing with those people who originally produced the foundation for what is today Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Greek philosophy, among other things. What I am saying, were it not for the Africans along the Nile, there would be no God Jehovah, no God Jesus, no God Allah, and no such thing as Greek philosophy. For example, to say that Moses, who was born in Africa, a place called Goshen in Egypt, got the first set of moral laws from a God which would be not before, at best, 1346, when Moses was born, and it couldn't be then, those so-called 10 Commandments, that those 10 Commandments plus 32 more were already in African writings, such as the Book of the Dead, the Osirian Drama, that the concept of monotheism didn't come from Moses, as taught in the synagogue and the mosque and the church, but in fact, it preceded Moses for hundreds of years, thousands of years, and at least taught by a man called Amenhotep IV or Akhenaten in terms of the god Atum. The concept of a virgin birth, that of Mary becoming pregnant by an immaculate conception, giving birth to her son, Horus, by this virgin birth, 4,100 years before the Mary-Joseph story, Jesus' story, the Africans had already taught about this in the person of Isis becoming pregnant by an immaculate conception and giving birth to her virgin son, Horus.
And so it was a personal triumph for Dr. Ben to have 800 of his brothers and sisters, young and old, come all the way from the United States to the Nile to see for themselves what he'd been saying for so long.
Yes, it's a fulfillment of a dream that started in 1939. I guess it started early in conceptualization, but the first time I came here was in 1939 when the British were in control. The old cataract you see up there was the kind of a citadel of British colonial power.
Were you able to stay at the Cataract Hotel?
No.
You couldn't stay there?
I couldn't walk in the gate. I didn't stay there. I stood in knapsack. I lie down and in the brushes in knapsack. And at that time, you still had cobras and crocodile infested areas. I couldn't, nothing looking like me could have stayed in the cataract. I don't care who you are. You could have been the richest man in Nubia. You couldn't stay in the cataract. It was strictly for whites only. Very few Arabs could stay in the cataract. Don't care how white he was. And don't care how rich he was. This was British aristocracy.
What drove you to come over here back then?
Well, my father primarily, and my father I had been rejected in school by a woman named Miss Armstrong. A teacher come from Texas and Puerto Rico told me in the classroom that my people didn't have anything to worry about other than Tarzan and Jane. And I went back and told my father. My father took his key, which he had carried around for neck for years. I didn't know. I knew he had a key around the neck, but I didn't know it was for. And he took that key and opened a little closet he had. I could see the book from the outside in the glass showcase. But when he gave me the key and told me, now, you read those books, and you read the references stated in those books, and all the bibliography in those books, and use the bibliography each one, and whatever they give, read that. And when you finish, come back and tell me who don't have a history. And of course, he was saying to me, you will never stop reading. You never stop finding about your history. And then when I went to that history, I found instead of myself not having an antiquitous history, it was the same person who had been teaching, Mrs. Armstrong. She didn't have a history before the Greeks. Her history started with the Greeks. Mine came here and beyond, up the Nile.
This identifying of Egypt as being outside of Africa was complicated by the European discovery of Egypt and their inability to attribute this grandeur, this civilization, to an African people. So the Western academic community ignored some of the great works on Africa written by whites in order to propagate the concept that Egypt was part of Europe or an extension of Asia. And what they failed to do is to distinguish between the invaders of Egypt and the indigenous people of Egypt. Egypt was probably more invaded than any country in the history of the world. And it is now people in the main by descendants of invaders. And what we need to do is to look at Africa in general. Everybody in Africa today who cannot be classified as an African is either an invader or a descendant of an invader. Many times these invaders are interpreting African history and interpreting African nations, the nations that their descendants moved in and tried to destroy.
Egypt is the home of the first functioning civilization that ultimately laid the basis for world civilization. And that civilization was built by African people. And it was built before the first European wore a shoe or lived in a house that had a window. Ben has been good in sharpening my perception of Egypt and the Nile Valley because as a teacher of Africa,